January 20, 1923. Berlin, Germany. 9:47 a.m. The woman stood at the bakery counter with a wheelbarrow. Not a basket. Not a purse. A wheelbarrow stacked with paper currency bundled in 1,000-mark notes, each bundle thick as a brick. She counted them out carefully, 1, 2, 3, 4, while the baker watched with the weary patience of someone who had seen this ritual 100 times. Behind her, a line of customers stretched out the door and into the frozen street, each holding their own bundles, their own absurd quantities of money that meant less with every passing hour. The price of a loaf of bread that morning was 250 billion marks. By afternoon it would be 400 billion. The woman completed her transaction, placed the single loaf in the now empty wheelbarrow and walked out. The money she had brought, bills printed with the faces of scholars and statesmen, would be worthless by evening. Some people used it as wallpaper. Others burned it for heat. It was more valuable as fuel than as currency. This was hyperinflation. Not the textbook definition, the sterile graphs showing exponential curves climbing toward infinity, but the lived reality. The moment when money stops being a store of value and becomes just paper, when a lifetime of savings evaporates in weeks, when the fundamental assumption that anchors civilization, that money means something, collapses. They had trusted their currency. By noon it was kindling. World War II did not begin with an invasion. It began with a debt. With reparations demanded and economies shattered and currencies destroyed. It began in the aftermath of World War I, when the victorious powers gathered at Versailles and made a decision that would reshape the century. Germany would pay for the war. All of it. The cost would be measured in gold marks, 132 billion of them, a sum so vast it exceeded Germany's entire GDP. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919. The reparations began immediately. And Germany, stripped of its colonies, its industrial base crippled, its population exhausted, discovered that it could not pay. So it did what governments have done throughout history when faced with debts they cannot service. It printed money. At first, the inflation was manageable. Prices rose but slowly. A few percentage points per year. Then a few percentage points per month. Then per week. Then per day. By 1923, the German mark was in free fall, its value halving every 48 hours. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before they became worthless. Restaurants changed their menus hourly. Savings accounts that had taken decades to accumulate were wiped out overnight. The hyperinflation destroyed the German middle class. It wiped out pensions, insurance policies, bonds, anything denominated in marks. And it created a generation of people who had learned, through brutal experience, that the system could not be trusted, that the institutions they had believed in, banks, government, currency, were fragile illusions that could vanish when you needed them most. This was the soil in which extremism grew. Not immediately. Not directly. But the link was there, undeniable and tragic. Economic catastrophe created desperation, and desperation made people willing to listen to anyone who promised to restore what had been lost. CTA, if this moment already changed how you see money, subscribe, the next will expose even more. The hyperinflation ended in November 1923, when the government introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed not by gold but by real estate and industrial assets. It was a desperate gamble, a monetary sleight of hand that somehow worked. Confidence returned. Prices stabilized. The economy began to recover. But the damage had been done. The psychological trauma of hyperinflation lingered long after the currency was stabilized. People who had seen their savings destroyed once knew it could happen again. Trust, once broken, does not easily heal. And then came the second shock. In October 1929, the American stock market collapsed. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had reached a peak of 381 points in September, fell to 198 points by November. Banks failed. Credit evaporated. The Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in modern history, began. The collapse spread across the Atlantic like a contagion. American banks recalled loans from European institutions. European banks, unable to meet their obligations, began failing. Austria's largest bank, Creditanstalt, collapsed in May 1931, triggering a cascade of failures across Central Europe. Germany, still dependent on American credit to finance its reparations payments, found itself trapped between impossible debts and vanishing capital. Unemployment in Germany rose from 1.3 million in 1929 to 6 million by 1932, nearly a third of the workforce. Industrial production collapsed. The banking system teetered on the edge of total failure. And the government, constrained by the need
Lauf,
to
bevor es
maintain the
weniger
value
wert
of the
ist.
Rentenmark
Ich weiß,
and
ich
meet
renne
its
schon.
reparations obligations, could not spend its way out of the crisis. This was the second financial catastrophe in a decade. And this time the political consequences were immediate. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazi Party received 18.3% of the vote, up from 2.6% 2 years earlier. In July 1932, they received 37.3%. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The connection between economic crisis and political extremism is not automatic. But it is real. People who have lost everything, savings, jobs, security, are willing to embrace radical solutions. They are willing to blame outsiders, to scapegoat minorities, to trade freedom for the promise of order. The Weimar Republic, battered by hyperinflation and depression, could not provide that order. Hitler promised he could. This is the financial story that history class skips. Not the battles or the atrocities or the geopolitics, but the economic wreckage that made the war possible. The Treaty of Versailles created a debt that Germany could not pay. The attempt to pay it destroyed the currency. The collapse of the currency destroyed the middle class. The Great Depression destroyed the economy. And the combination of these financial catastrophes created the conditions in which fascism could flourish. It was not inevitable. Other choices could have been made. The reparations could have been reduced or forgiven. The central banks could have coordinated to prevent the depression from spreading. The international community could have intervened to stabilize Germany's economy before it collapsed. But those choices were not made. And the result was a war that killed 70 million people. A German accountant named Friedrich, 42, father of 3, employed by a textile firm in Munich, kept a diary during the early 1930s. In an entry dated March 1932, he wrote, "I have worked for 20 years. I saved every month. I did everything right. And now my savings are gone. The bank says there is nothing they can do. The government says they cannot help. My children ask why we have no food and I have no answer. I voted for the Republic. I believed in democracy. But democracy cannot put bread on the table. And now men are marching in the streets, promising order, promising work, promising revenge. I do not agree with them. But I understand why people listen." Friedrich did not join the Nazi Party. But millions did. And the reason was not ideology, at least not initially. It was economics. It was the lived experience of watching the system fail, repeatedly and catastrophically, until the only remaining option seemed to be to burn it down and start over. The financial architecture of the 1920s and 1930s was built on a series of assumptions that proved disastrously wrong. The first was that war debts and reparations could be paid without destabilizing the global economy. The second was that central banks could maintain the gold standard, a system where currencies were pegged to gold, without triggering deflationary spirals. The third was that markets would self-correct, that crises were temporary disruptions that would resolve themselves without government intervention. All three assumptions failed. The reparations created a transfer problem. Germany had to export more than it imported to generate the foreign currency needed to pay its debts. This required suppressing domestic consumption and wages, which made the German population poorer and more desperate. When the Depression hit, export markets collapsed, and the transfer became impossible. The gold standard locked countries into deflationary policies. When the money supply contracted, prices fell, unemployment rose, and economic activity ground to a halt. Countries that tried to inflate their way out, by printing money or devaluing their currencies, were accused of irresponsibility and punished by capital flight. Countries that maintained the gold standard, like Germany, suffered mass unemployment and social unrest. And the belief in market self-correction meant that governments did not intervene until it was too late. The U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates in 1928 to cool stock market speculation, inadvertently triggering the 1929 crash. European central banks tightened credit to defend their gold reserves, deepening the depression. By the time policymakers realized that intervention was necessary, the damage had been done. The system was designed to maintain stability. Instead, it amplified shocks and transmitted them across borders. It turned a stock market crash into a global depression. And it created the conditions for the deadliest war in human history. If you're seeing the financial system in a new light, subscribe. The aftermath will challenge you even more. In June 1932, the Lausanne Conference convened to address the reparations crisis. The major powers, Britain, France, Germany, agreed to reduce Germany's debt by 90%, effectively canceling the reparations. It was too late. The economic damage had been done. The political extremism had taken root. And the concession, which might have prevented disaster if made in 1920, was now merely a footnote to catastrophe. Hitler came to power 7 months later. One of his first acts was to repudiate the remaining reparations. Germany would pay nothing. The international community protested but did not intervene. The precedent was set. Treaties could be broken, debts could be ignored, and power, not law, determined outcomes. Hitler's economic policy was straightforward: rearm, rebuild, and prepare for war. Unemployment was addressed through massive public works projects: highways, buildings, military infrastructure. The Autobahn system, often cited as a marvel of engineering, was designed primarily to facilitate the rapid movement of troops and tanks. The economy was militarized. Every decision, every investment, every policy was oriented toward the coming conflict. The financing came from several sources. First, deficit spending. The government borrowed heavily, issuing bonds that were purchased by German banks under pressure. Second, monetary expansion. The Reichsbank printed money, carefully managing inflation by imposing price controls and rationing. Third, plunder. As Germany conquered neighboring countries, it seized gold reserves, industrial assets, and forced labor. The war economy was sustained by theft on a continental scale. By 1939, Germany's military spending accounted for 23% of GDP. By 1943, it was 70%. The economy was no longer producing for civilian consumption. It was producing for war. And when the war ended, the economy collapsed. Again. The financial story of World War II is not just about Germany. It is about the global system that enabled the crisis. About the gold standard that transmitted deflation across borders. About the central banks that prioritized currency stability over employment. About the reparations that punished a defeated nation until it became desperate enough to embrace extremism. And it is about the choices not made. The debts that could have been forgiven. The interventions that could have been attempted. The cooperation that could have prevented catastrophe. In 1944, as the war neared its end, representatives from 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new financial order. They understood, belatedly, that the system that had produced 2 world wars in a generation needed to be dismantled and replaced. The result was a new architecture: fixed exchange rates, capital controls, international institutions to manage crises. The gold standard was abandoned. The commitment to free capital flows was suspended. The priority was stability, not ideology. The Bretton Woods system was not perfect. But it worked. For 30 years, it provided the framework for reconstruction, growth, and relative peace. And when it eventually broke down in the 1970s, the world had learned enough from the disasters of the 1920s and 1930s to avoid repeating them. Friedrich, the Munich accountant, survived the war. His home was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid in 1944, but he and his family survived. In 1948, Germany introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, as part of a comprehensive economic reform. Friedrich received 40 marks in exchange for his old Reichsmarks, plus a monthly allowance of 60 marks. It was not much, but it was stable. And stability, after 15 years of chaos, was enough. In the 1960s, Friedrich wrote a memoir for his grandchildren. In it, he described the hyperinflation, the depression, the rise of Hitler, and the war. And he offered a single piece of advice: do not trust systems. Trust people. Systems are built by men, and men make mistakes. When a system fails, it is the people who suffer. So watch the people in power. Hold them accountable. Demand that they act with wisdom and restraint. Because if they do not, if they prioritize ideology over pragmatism, if they punish rather than forgive, if they cling to failed policies because admitting error seems weak, then the suffering will come. And it will come for everyone. The woman with the wheelbarrow, standing in line at the Berlin bakery in January 1923, did not know she was living through a financial catastrophe that would reshape the world. She only knew that her money was worthless, that her savings were gone, that the system she had trusted had failed. She took her loaf of bread and went home and tried to feed her family. And she remembered. A generation later, when the war ended and the cities were rubble and the currency was worthless again, she remembered the wheelbarrow. She remembered the hyperinflation. She remembered the moment when she learned that money is not value but trust, and that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. The financial story behind World War II is not taught in history class because it is uncomfortable. It reveals that the war was not an aberration but a consequence. A predictable, preventable consequence of policies that prioritized punishment over pragmatism, ideology over stability, and revenge over reconciliation. It reveals that the victors of World War I made choices that made World War II possible. And it reveals that economic systems, no matter how carefully designed, can fail catastrophically if the people managing them lack the wisdom to adapt when conditions change. The wheelbarrow sits in a museum now, a relic of a crisis most people have forgotten. But the lesson remains. Money is trust. Systems are fragile. And the choices we make, about debt, about currency, about how we respond to crisis, echo forward through generations, shaping futures we cannot see. They brought wheelbarrows to buy bread. By evening the bread was gone and the money was ash. And the world that emerged from that failure, the desperation, the extremism, the war, was built on the ruins of a system that had promised stability and delivered catastrophe. The war taught them to fear the enemy. The hyperinflation taught them to fear their own institutions. And the space between those two fears, the void where trust used to live, became the breeding ground for the darkest chapter in human history. They had trusted the system. They learned it was built on paper. And when the paper burned, everything else burned with it.